Репортажі про культурно-громадську діяльність відділу УНО в Канаді, спонсоровані фундацією Бориса Городинського.
Добрий вечір. Good evening. When I was invited to attend this conference by Yuri Klufas, I said no. I said no because I really didn't have any idea of what I might speak about. Finally, after some persuasion, I agreed to take this on, and then I began to write my notes for tonight. Originally, I was going to call this the UNF and I, but now I've decided to call it me and the UNF. The reason I switched the order there is very simple. In August of 2022, the Ukrainian National Federation was declared, quote unquote, an undesirable organization by the so-called Russian Federation. However, I was given the distinction of being a persona non grata in April of 2022, so I beat you. The problem with that was that when I got my notice, I was troubled, not by being honored by the so-called Russian Federation as a persona non grata, but because they spelled my name wrong. And so I wrote to the Russian Federation and I said to the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I said, excuse me, Pan Lavrov, but you misspelled my name. And he hasn't responded yet. He's a little bit busy, I guess. Anyway, when I was first invited by Yuri, and thank you very much, Yuri. I don't know why they reappointed you president, but that's a different question. I really wasn't sure that I should take this on. I'd never really given much thought to UNO, to its purpose, to its contributions, nor to its impact on my life. And I say to you right at the start, this was a mistake, an error on my part, that I aim, at least in part, to correct with what I say to you this evening. Now, obviously, I've been aware of your organization for most of my adult life, but I was never a member. And as many of you who know me, Boyle Gorod and others, Lasha Kichi, Igor Parden, Andriy Sukhanivsky, and others, I was never really much of a joiner either. Indeed, I became active in the Ukrainian-Canadian community, within the Hromada, as we might say, only around 1984-85, and in the ranks of a group that was created specifically to address Soviet-era disinformation about the alleged presence of supposedly thousands of so-called Nazi war criminals in Canada. That was when the Civil Liberties Commission was established as a task group associated with, but not part of the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, not part of KONTAKT, as a group that was specifically organized to deal with Soviet-era disinformation. And I got very enthusiastically involved with what was called the CLC and later became UKLA, the Ukrainian-Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Why? Because it was project-driven. It was goal-oriented. It had a focus. And as compared to the other organizations that I then saw in the community, I thought it was dynamic, as compared to the more predictable and staid and somewhat non-performing mainstream organizations. So there I was, age 31, getting on to 32, involved with the CLC, defending the good name of our community against Soviet propagandists and their fellow travelers here in the West, of whom there are many. And this was all within the context, as some of you will remember, of the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals headed by Mr. Justice Jules Deschênes, so-called Deschênes Commission. The commission was active from about 1985 until March of 1987. My diary, and I keep a daily diary, and I'll be writing about this sometime around midnight tonight, records that the foundational meeting of the Civil Liberties Commission took place 39 years ago in Toronto on the 7th of February 1985. And that is when I first met John Gregorovich. John Gregorovich became the chairman of the Civil Liberties Commission and later of UCLA. It was a meeting that was held here in Toronto, and present among the other dignitaries were Senator Paul Yuzek, Boris Sirske, and Petro Savarin, among others. That was when the CLC was created and when I came back, as it were, to the Armada. And here's where I have to sort of take a slight detour and tell you something else. Many of you will know that I was born in Kingston, Ontario, after the Second World War. Kingston is a very small city to this day, 120,000 people, much smaller when I was alive, born. It's a very Anglo-Celtic city, a very Protestant city, and it has never had a Ukrainian Armada of any great size. In fact, when I was growing up, perhaps 20, 25 families were active. My corner of it, when I was born in 1953, that's the year Stalin died, that's why I wear the mustache. My corner of that community was comprised mainly of so-called displaced persons, the DPs, part of that third wave of Ukrainian immigrants who came to Canada after the Second World War. So there were veterans there of OUN, of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Melnikivci and Banderiuchi, veterans of UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, veterans of the Divizia Halichina. There were slave laborers. There were survivors like my grandmother of the Holodomor and my godmother as well. There were Ukrainian Catholics and Ukrainian Orthodox believers. Most of those people were, of course, from Western Ukraine, from Halichina, but there were also some from the greater Ukraine or Soviet Ukraine. And organizing us, keeping us all together, we had St. Michael's Ukrainian Catholic Parish, which included some interwar immigrants, people who'd come here between the two world wars. We cooperated and collaborated together until 1980, when a schism in our ranks broke us apart. But until that time, until 1980, we were too few in number in Kingston to not cooperate with each other. So I actually grew up in an environment where it didn't matter whether you were a veteran of UPA from Volyn, who was a Melnikivich, or people like my father, who was a stalwart Banderievich. It didn't matter whether you were Pravoslavny or Catholic, whether you're from Veliko Ukraina or from Halichina. What mattered was one thing only, and that was whether or not you were wedded to the cause. To what cause, you say? To the cause of Ukraine's independence. Now, when I think back to those years, and I think back to the way in which I was raised and that struggle that we used to be engaged in for Ukraine's independence, it seemed to me then, and it still does now, that for the organized Ukrainian community, what brings us together is our shared focus on the homeland, on the Krai. Most of our neighbors, most of our Canadian friends, at school, at university, in our parishes, in our workplaces, in our neighborhoods, had little understanding of Ukraine or Ukrainians. They simply didn't know very much about us. Now contrast that with the current time. Contrast that with today. It's remarkable. I have lived a life where I have seen Ukraine go from nothingness to what exists today. At no time in human history has Ukraine been better known than it is today. And that is because of the dynamic resistance, the valor, the endurance of the men and women who are fighting, as I speak, on the front lines against Russian aggression. This is remarkable. Now, my parents, the DPs of their time, the third wave, for them, the cause of Ukraine's independence was what they were focused on. It was an abiding interest. It was intense. And as they got older, as we all do, they said, if we're not there to do this, the next generation must continue the struggle, must continue to support the cause. And so they transmitted it. They educated us in it. They inculcated that abiding interest in Ukraine into the next generation, which was me. The intensity of that could sometimes be very difficult to accept. It was a burden. Every year, I attend Remembrance Day services at the Royal Military College where I teach. And every year, that very famous poem by John McCrae is read out, recited by a student in Flanders Fields. And when I listen to some of the stanzas from that poem, that remarkable poem, I get emotionally caught up again in the Ukrainian cause, believe it or not, because there's that very powerful stanza, and I'll read it to you. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you, from failing hands, we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. Because if ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep. Wow. Wow. If we break faith with our parents, with our grandparents, they won't sleep. That was the cause. It was passed on. Now, look, I'm no hero. That was overwhelming. That was alienating. It was often too much. My parents sent me to Sum. They sent me to Camp Veselka. Still looking for that rainbow. I was not a happy camper. I'm probably going to get killed in homing for that one. And so I have to say to you very honestly, I rejected it. I walked away from it, as did most of the young men and women that I grew up with in Kingston. Most of them are no longer involved in the community. I began my university career at Queen's University, determined to become a biologist, and specifically a herpetologist. I wanted to study newts and salamanders. I also wanted to be a cement truck driver, but neither one of those careers worked out. My desire to stay in the sort of sciences was actually furthered by a man who had a profound impact on my life, the Reverend J.C.E. Uriot, who himself was actually a very talented entomologist working for the Royal Ontario Museum here in Toronto, who gave me summer employment at Queen's University's Biological Research Station for several years. So I had the opportunity to actually leave the community and get into the kind of field I wanted to be part of. That was when I got to university. It was 1972, my first degree, my honors BSc. And something happened to me at Queen's, something I did not anticipate. I realized that most of my fellow students, and most of my professors, most of the people who I liked, who I interacted with on an almost daily basis, were indifferent, ignorant, and sometimes even hostile to the very idea of Ukrainian independence, the very ideal, the cause that my parents raised me to believe in. There was a real double standard evident at the time. Everyone was talking about civil liberties and human rights and national liberation movements everywhere around the world. But when I said, well, what about Ukraine and the Soviet Union? Oh, no, that's different. And I couldn't understand that. That exceptionalism stoked frustration in me and anger and resistance. And when I then began to do my MA in historical geography, under the supervision of a man who's become my friend since then, Peter Goheen, I began studying a topic that I didn't want to study. Because in those days, if you're a graduate student and your supervisor said, this is what you'll study, that's what you study. And so Peter said to me, Lubomir, you will do a historical geography of the Ukrainian community in Kingston. And I said, no, I won't. And he said, yes, you will. And so I did. Why would I be so opposed? Because why study my parents and Pan Kuzmin and my Krasna Baba and all those people? Like, I knew them. I went to church with them. I was in St. Michael's Parish. You know, they sent me to Sum. I didn't want to study them, but that's what I was told to do. So out I went with a tape recorder. Richard Pierce in the Department of History said, oral history is a good way to do research if you can't find archives. So off I went and I began to interview people. And one of the very first people I interviewed was Rosalie Harteniuk. Now, she was a widow at that time of a veteran from the First World War, a man who had fought for Ukraine's liberation, a man who'd survived that and had become a member of the Ukrainian War Veterans Association, which would play a great role in the creation of UNO many years later. And Mrs. Harteniuk, who I remember vaguely as being a kind of strange little old lady living by herself on Colburn Street, she was very generous when we went for Koyada. You know, you always get lots of chocolates, but the place smelled of mothballs. And, you know, you're never sure about what kind of chocolate you got, but what the hell, we ate it. And my diary, I looked it up. My diary, I spent 7 hours with her and wrote when I left, what a waste of a day. What a waste of a day. And you know what? I couldn't have been more wrong. That was the most important conversation of my academic life. So for those of you who are younger in the audience and listening to me, you know, here's a lesson. Sometimes you have no idea when the gold lands on your plate. The nuggets. Wow. Mrs. Harteniuk told me about 2 people who changed my whole life, even though I didn't know it at the time. I'm not pretending that I had, you know, some kind of vision that this was going to happen. But in the conversation we had, she was rambling on and on and on and on, and she had all sorts of issues with her neighbors and all that kind of stuff. And I'm trying to get her to tell me about, you know, the experience of being a Ukrainian living in Kingston in the interwar period, and she rambled. But she mentioned 2 people. I said to her, Mrs. Harteniuk, were there any Ukrainians here when you arrived in between the 2 world wars? And she said, yeah, there were a few. There were some people who were here around World War I. I said, oh, you remember any of their names? Because as far as I figured, they were all dead. She said, yeah, there was a guy called Nick Sakalyuk, Mykola Sakalyuk. Never heard of him. I said, is he alive? Well, I don't know for sure, she said, but I think he moved to Toronto, and I think he's associated with the Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral. Still remember, 400 Bathurst Street. So I pulled out a phone book. I see blank faces there. Phone book was a thick thing with names, and you'd look up a name by alphabetical order, and you'd find their phone number and an address. It's a very handy thing. I still have one. And I looked up Sakalyuk, and sure enough, there he was. So I phoned him up, and I said, were you in Kingston? Yes. So, Pan Sakalyuk, yeah. Could I come and interview you? And I will remember the day that I did that. That was the 14th of February, 1978. Why do I remember that day? Well, Valentine's Day. And boy, did I get into doo-doo for leaving my girlfriend at the time on Valentine's Day to come talk to some old Ukrainian on Bathurst Street. She didn't like that. Needless to say, we're not together. But I got up to Toronto, and I interviewed him and discovered that he was actually a survivor of Canada's first national internment operations. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the story of that episode in our national history came to light. And it was then on the basis of that interview and what I learned from Pan Sakalyuk, who 3 years later to the day, believe it or not, 14th of February 1981, stepped off a curb and was killed by a car. If I hadn't recorded that story, we would have probably forgotten all about what happened to Ukrainians, who are commemorated now thanks to people like Igor Bardin right across the country, thanks to the work of the Canadian First World War Interment Recognition Fund. She also mentioned to me the name Bogdan Panchuk. I said, who's Bogdan Panchuk? She said, oh, he was a Ukrainian Canadian who volunteered to serve overseas in the war during the Second World War. He served in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He went to England, and just at the D-Day landings, Panchuk was on D-Day in Normandy, I think D-Day +1. And on the beaches, and shortly after they got off the beaches, Panchuk encountered his first Ukrainian displaced person in German uniform shooting at him. But that's a different story. Panchuk then begins to organize the Ukrainian Canadian Servicemen's Association and the Central Ukrainian Relief Bureau, would then go on to save literally tens of thousands of Ukrainian displaced persons, victims of war and political refugees, from forcible repatriation to the Soviet Union. So Bogdan Panchuk and others who were working with him. Some of you will remember Stanley Frolik, Peter Smilsky, and others, and Hrapliva. These were the men and the women in Canadian uniform who saved our parents or grandparents. I'd never heard of him. And yet Panchuk would then later become the subject of my doctoral dissertation on the post-World War II immigration of Ukrainian displaced persons to Canada. So from one interview, I got two names that changed my life. I spent 20 plus years arguing for redress for Canada's first national internment operations, and I have spent the rest of my life defending the good name of Ukrainians against Soviet-era disinformation, now being regurgitated by the Russian Federation about how we were supposedly Nazi collaborators and enablers of the Holocaust and so on. I also at that time met a man here in Toronto by the name of Stefan Pavlyuk, who ran something called the Ukrainian Canadian Research Foundation. And he was the one who actually shared with me Sir William Desmond Otter's final report on the internment operations, giving me documentary evidence about an episode in Canadian history that the Canadian government had tried to suppress. So slowly, by the time I was finishing my PhD in 1984 at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, I came to understand how the internment operations had had a profound impact on our organized community. Not just the rounding up of enemy aliens, not just the fact that several thousand of them were placed in internment camps across Canada, 24 camps, not just the censorship, not just the restrictions on freedom of speech and freedom of association and movement, not just the disenfranchisement, the stripping of the vote, all these state-sanctioned censures imposed upon innocents, enemy aliens, in fact amounted to what I referred to with my colleague Bogdan Kordan as a crippling legacy, one that has echoed to the present day. And we don't think about this often enough. But when Ottawa's men created KOOK, the Ukrainian Canadian Committee, or the Ukrainian Canadian Congress as it's now known, they themselves reported that Ukrainian Canadian leaders, 1940 November, Winnipeg, creation of KOOK, are, quote, still in fear of the barbed wire fence. So, KOOK is created by the government. There's this lingering legacy. It took us decades to get the government of Canada to finally recognize that. At first, they denied it ever happened. Then they said, well, it happened, but why don't you people just forget about it? Something they never said to any other community. And then finally, in 2008, they announced symbolic redress and recognition here at Stanley Barracks. Some of you were there present that day when Jason Kenney, on behalf of the government of the day, signed the accord that established the Canadian First World War Internment Recognition Fund so that we now have markers, statues, films, books across the country. Now, while I was doing all of that, as if I didn't have enough on my plate, I was coming up to from Kingston to Toronto on a regular basis and taking advantage, for once, of my SUM background. I got in touch with the late Andriy Bandera. Andriy Bandera, who you may remember was the editor of Ukrainian Echo, was the first person to encourage me to write. So, to his memory, to this day, I thank Andriy, because if it hadn't been for him giving me a chance to write in the pages of Homin Ukrainian or Ukrainian Echo, the English language version, I probably would have never tried to write the kinds of op-eds and articles that I've come to be famous, infamous for. In those days, I was Ivan Britva, Johnny Razor, I like that one, and Victor Roma, Victor the Thunderer or something like that. I mean, I wrote under pseudonyms because in those days I was pushing my luck. I'll always remember there was one conversation we had with Jerry Weiner, the Minister of Multiculturalism at the time. He looked across the table from me in Montreal and said, the internment operations never happened. That's what he literally said. So I came back and wrote one of my earliest pieces, Time for a Wiener Roast. So you'll forgive me for not identifying myself in those days. When I came into contact with Andriy and started writing, And, you know, this was the Середовище, this was the Hromada that I knew. League of Zvolny Ukraine, Canadian League for the Liberation of Ukraine, now the League of Ukrainian Canadians. I didn't think very much about UNO, so I'm coming back to UNO, don't worry. I knew that it was dominated in the post-World War II period by members of the competing nationalist faction, the Melnik faction, the Melnik-UG. At the time, frankly, UNO did not seem to me to be all that relevant to the cause. If words, simple words can define organizations, I would have said at the time, I'll change my mind before I end, so don't yell at me yet. I would have at the time in the 80s said that UNO was insipid, whereas Liga was inflamed. Now, those were very different things, and I was still a young guy then. I was a young Turk, if you like, and so I admired the sort of more revolutionary dynamic qualities of Liga. And I stand here before you now and say that, and also admit that the reason I had those feelings was because I was ignorant of the truth about what the core values and qualities of UNO and its early membership were. I did not fully understand or appreciate what UNO had been and was. Now, I was still tied to the cause of my parents. I also had begun to investigate the role played by characters like Bogdan Panchuk and Stefan Pavlyuk and Stanley Froelich, one of the first presidents of MUNA. I started to understand all that better, and then eventually finished the PhD and came back here to Toronto in 1984 to join the Department of Geography as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto. And that's when I became better acquainted with the chair holder, Professor Paul Robert Margocci, who's become a lifelong friend since then, and with the work of the remarkable Chair Foundation, and particularly with the work of Ihor Barbin, who's sitting right here, who created, I believe it was in 1991, the Canada-Ukraine Parliamentary Program. That is, in my view, absolutely one of the most important, significant, and consequential programs ever launched in the Ukrainian Canadian community. So Ihor, that one for you. Now, as I said, I kept a diary, and at this time, with the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals doing its work, the CLC engaged in that very actively, defending the good name of Ukrainian Canadians, I actually wrote down that I'm afraid of self-immolation, because that's what I wrote, self-immolation. Kind of a weird phrase, but there you go. That's what I wrote, because I was at the forefront. I was a spokesperson, and I was taking all the barbs and arrows. And it hurt, and it had consequences for my career. It did, negative ones. It cost me. So what did I do it? Well, I met veterans of the Galicia Division. I knew hundreds of displaced persons whom I'd interviewed for my PhD. I, like John Gregorovich, suspected that this was all Soviet disinformation being planted, fake news being planted into the Canadian public domain. But we couldn't prove it. So we simply articulated the following principled position. The position of the Ukrainian Canadian community then and now was and remains that if there's any evidence that an individual, regardless of who they may be by gender or political philosophy or regional identification or faith group, whatever, whatever you are, whoever you are, if there's evidence that you committed a crime against humanity or a war crime, put that evidence in front of the proper authorities and bring that person to justice in a Canadian Criminal Court of Law. Period. Simple. Doesn't matter whether you're Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish, Sri Lankan, Vietnamese, Chinese, whatever the hell you are. If there's evidence against you, put that evidence forward and let the authorities, let the judicial system decide. That was a position we took, and it was a correct position and remains the correct position. And that is how, in a sense, we quote-unquote won the debate with Duchenne. But we had this kind of lingering suspicion that everything that had happened had been orchestrated by the Soviets. We couldn't prove it, of course. But now we can. because we have now found the actual KGB documents about something called Operation Payback or Operation Retribution, which confirms that in the late 1970s, the Soviets tried to sow discord between the Ukrainian and Jewish diasporas by playing on these allegations of wartime criminality to split the emerging united front that Jews and Ukrainians and Baltic communities in the diaspora had started to organize in defense of the dissidents, the human rights activists, the refuseniks, and so on. The Soviets were terribly afraid of that. And so they began deliberately planting fake news about how Ukrainians and Lithuanians and Latvians had collaborated with the Nazis to create tensions between the Jewish and Ukrainian diasporas. And it worked. And the Soviets in this document, Operation Payback, 1985, confirmed that they were so successful in the United States in creating the Office of Special Investigations within the Department of Justice that they would do the same thing in Canada. And they actually brag about how they planted stories in the Toronto Star and gave us the Commission of Inquiry on War Criminals. They brag about it. So what we suspected was in fact true. So we had the Civil Liberties Commission, we did our work. We were disbanded, unfortunately, by past president of KOOK, who thought we were no longer necessary. So John Gregorovich, who some of you will remember was a rather eccentric kind of fellow, but a true patriot, had us reshaped and reform as the Ukrainian Canadian Civil Liberties Association, with which I'm still associated. In those years, we took on other issues, the redress issue, Philip Konoval, and so on. We bore witness, as did many of you, to the exfoliation of the Soviet Union in 1991. And I'm sure, like all of you, I was delighted to see the Soviet Empire collapse, particularly happy to see that happen in the lifetime of my parents. This had been what they had hoped for all their lives, and it happened. So they finally saw the re-emergence, as I say, of an independent Ukrainian state in Europe. Still, somehow, maybe this is the academic in me, I was troubled by what I was seeing post-1991. There was this lingering legacy of the Soviet experience, a kind of Soviet mentality. You could see it in the corruption that's existed in Ukraine. You could see it in the way in which they lagged behind many of the other countries of East Central Europe in moving forward. And I got a lot of questions. This was an exciting time. The Soviet Union's collapsing, democracy seems to have triumphed. Remember, it was the end of history, the triumph of liberal democracies we all believed in. And my students would say, well, sir, whether it was at Queen's or RMC, they'd say, why isn't Ukraine now like us? Why aren't they catching up? I mean, Soviet Union's gone. You guys all wanted to be independent. You're independent now. Why aren't you more like us? And so I had to think hard on what I would say to those kids. And I thought on this, I came on this idea. I said, well, if you've ever read the good book, anybody know what I'm talking about? It's called the Bible. Okay. If you read the good book, there's a story in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, about how Moses led his people out of Egyptian bondage to the Promised Land. And how, when he took them out of Egypt, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, we all know Moses was a man, but why would it take him 40 years to get from Egypt to Palestine, Israel, whatever you want to call it, I'm not getting into that one, to the Holy Land? 40 years, that's not that far. Well, he was a man, he didn't ask for directions. That's probably the first obvious answer. But the truth is, in the Bible, it tells us the answer. The Bible gives us the answer to this. People born in slavery and captivity have a mindset, have a mentality that does not allow them to build a free state. And even Moses himself, the great leader, could only look down from the mountain and see that the next generation was getting to the Promised Land. Even he didn't get there. So, to get myself out of an awkward question from students, I'd say, no problem. When will Ukraine become a normal state? 1991 plus 40, 2031. I retire next year, so no one's ever going to ask me when it happens. Done. But I think there's some truth to this, that it takes time. And we were so anxious for everything to go like that. Okay? It doesn't work that way, I've learned. Now, we witnessed the Orange Revolution. We applauded it. We witnessed the Revolution of Dignity, the Euromaidan Revolution in 2014. And then we realized something else. We forgot about something in all of these celebrations and all of this triumphalism. There's the other guys. The other guys who were never pro-Ukrainian independence. There's that other generation back in the place of bondage. The generation that is represented today by no one else than Vladimir Putin, the KGB man in the Kremlin. He has initiated the Russian war against Ukraine and Ukrainians. And notice how I phrased it, the Russian war against Ukraine and Ukrainians. This is not about Vladimir Putin alone and his confederates and the oligarchs. This is a Russian war against the existence of you and me and the Ukrainian state. And it started in 2014, and it's escalated, and it has become a genocidal agenda. Orchestrated, organized, directed by the KGB man in the Kremlin. He is our century's pharaoh. So, who's our Moses? Volodymyr Zelensky. I've called him that before many times, Ukraine's Moses. He is now leading his nation out of Russian captivity and bondage, following that famous old slogan, away from Moscow. Ukraine is again standing up against the ancient foe, against the very same foe we faced in Tsarist times, in Soviet times, and now again in the 21st century. We are facing off against a man, the KGB man in the Kremlin, whose grandfather was in the Cheka and was literally a servant of Stalin, and whose father was in the NKVD, and who himself served in the KGB. 3 generations in the Putin family of Soviet secret policemen. Remember that. And he's roughly my age. He's the enemy, I'm the enemy. No surprise then that when Putin launched his genocidal campaign against Ukraine, go back to what he actually said in February of 2022. He said this is a war, a special military operation to rid Ukraine of what? Of the Banderivci. That's actually what he said. And then, of course, they quickly switched that to Nazis because, hey, face it, outside of this audience, nobody knows what a Banderivci is. So they became denazification of Ukraine. Now, again, when I began to think about all these themes and what I was going to say to you, I thought about putting words to paper that would somehow reflect not only what I've accomplished, but about UNF. Remember, UNO was established in July of 1932 in Edmonton. Who was the first president? The first president of UNO was Andrew Grigorovich. Not Andrew Grigorovich, who some of you remember as the bibliophile and activist here in Toronto, but his father. And who was the other son? John Grigorovich, who mentored me through the Civil Liberties Commission, and then UCLA. And what was UNO when it was established? It was an amalgamation of different organizations. The Ukrainian War Veterans Association, which was formed to represent the veterans of the independence struggle of the First World War period. Veterans of the Ukrainian Military Organization, UVO, and veterans and members of the underground nationalist movement, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, before the split. Who do I come from? Well, from the third wave DPs. Where does UNO come from? From the first wave of Ukrainian settlers to Canada who were patriots, who were nationalists, who then brought into their ranks those who came in the second wave. Okay. And I come from the third wave, the son of DPs who were Banderivci. The Kingston branch of the League for the Liberation of Ukraine was established in my parents' home on Nelson Street. Ihor Gozenko apparently bounced me on his knees. I don't remember the man, but he was the one that exposed Soviet spy networks in Canada. UNO, when it was created in 1932, explicitly said that anyone could be a member of UNO, regardless of what political party they might support in Canada, regardless of their socioeconomic class, regardless of whether they were Pravoslavny or Catholic, or where they came from. Everyone was welcome under the banner of UNO for the support of the cause of Ukraine's independent statehood. And what was the cause for the Banderivci? Again, the same thing. The independence of a sovereign, united Ukrainian state. Now, I began to realize this when I started thinking about all these things and remembered Stefan Pawliuk, who I've mentioned already. If you go back to some of the original documents published by UNO and MUNO in Canada, look up the booklet, I shared it with Yuri, called 7 Presidents in Uniform. Pawliuk was the first president of the Toronto branch of MUNO, Молоді Українські Націоналісти. And they, of course, in English call themselves the Ukrainian Canadian Youth Association because they fully recognize that if you called yourself a nationalist in the 30s in Canada, that might not go well for you. So MUNO is Молоді Українські Націоналісти. This tells you who they were. And I was mentored by people like Stefan Pawliuk, by John Gregorovich, by Ihor Bardin later, by others like Stanley Frolik, Sviatoslav Frolik, who was a member of MUN, who was sent back to Western Ukraine, who was there when the Second World War broke out, who was then chased by the NKVD right across the Soviet Union to escape via Vladivostok, to then come back to Toronto and eventually go back overseas to work with Panchuk, helping rescue the DPs, including my parents and some of yours. So when I think about it, I realize that in my life, I've been schooled about why and how I must stand up for Ukraine, must defend the good name of Ukrainians, and must always, always challenge the foe by men from UNO. Men from UNO. Yuzik, Pawliuk, Gregorovich, Frolik, Bardin, and others that I can't mention them all. Lutzyuk, another one. Integrity, intelligence, determination. Men who actually shared their ideal, and this goes back to 1932 Edmonton, of permanent warfare. That was the idea in forming UNO. We can't give up. This is permanent. This is a constant struggle to secure and maintain Ukraine's independence. So if you like, some of what I am, the joy I think you probably sense in me of being a warrior for our cause, for our just cause, comes from those men who taught me that that's the right way to be. So that's what I tried to do in the spirit of Frolik and Gregorovich and Pawliuk and Yuzik and others. I acted. I followed Panchuk's gospel, Robi щось, do something. That's all he said, my simple gospel, Robi щось, do something. So I stood up and I helped counter the miasma being spread in Canada in the 1980s about supposed Nazi war criminals hiding in our community. That was the Deschênes Commission. Most recently, I had the quote-unquote pleasure of standing up in the House of Commons with respect to the Hunka incident and asking all members of all parties represented in the House of Commons to apologize to Yaroslav Hunka for the injustice they did to him. I worked with members of UNO to secure redress for Canada's first national internment operations. That secured a $10 million endowment that is now within the Shevchenko Foundation, there to further additional research about this still relatively little known episode in Canadian history. Think about it, Ukrainians and other Europeans, under the terms of the War Measures Act that would be used against our fellow Japanese, German, and Italian and Jewish Canadians in the Second World War, and against some of our fellow Quebecois in 1970. The same act, the War Measures Act, was first used against us and had a crippling legacy for our community. We recovered, working with members of UNO, the memory of Corporal Philip Coneval, who's celebrated in this very budinok, whose branch number 360 of the Royal Canadian Legion was named after Coneval, a man who won the Victoria Cross, the highest medal of the British Empire, for his valor at the Battle of Hill 70 during the First World War. Today, if you go to the Canadian War Museum, you'll see his Victoria Cross on permanent display. Today, if you go to Vimy Ridge and you go down the hill to Hill 70, you'll see the Coneval Walk and the memorial to that brave Ukrainian Canadian. Now again, as I say, all of these kinds of things, and those are just a sample of things I've done over the years, have not been without some cost to my career, to my livelihood, to my reputation. So be it. I stand before you tonight saying that I think I've done my best to fight the good fight. I have very few regrets. And so it was that a boy from Kingston, who became the old man who now stands before you on this podium, who was never a member of UNO, actually turns out, to his own surprise, to have always been engaged with the very core principles of UNO, the same principles that motivate each and every one of you to this same day, namely our support for the existence of an independent, united, and sovereign Ukraine in Europe. That is our support for the cause. And if you think that this is sort of just a flowery speech, allow me to quote one of yours, Paul Luzuk, who as a young man and as the first president of the Молоді Українські Націоналісти gave a paper, or gave an address, in February of 1935. And I'm going to just read you a short paragraph from that. He was talking about the role of youth. So those of you who are MUNO, younger, think about what he said. The role of youth in the life of a nation. Here's what he wrote. We wish to attract and draw in that youth which does not yet understand their responsibility, and even those who do not admit who they are, because the old party feuds repulsed them and made them ashamed to be known as Ukrainians. We want to eradicate the feeling of inferiority and to replace it with the grand ideal of national freedom, to develop in our youth undaunted characters, to teach them to place the interests of the Ukrainian nation above their own personal ones, and to count on their own resources, because only then will they be ready to be of service to the cry, to the old country, as well as to our new native land of Canada. Wow. Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed from 1935 to 2024, nor should it have. That same clarion call, voiced decades ago, echoes to this day. And so it dawned on me as I wrote these words and prepared for this speech that in fact, we are all members of UNO. I shall forever, therefore, be grateful to the stalwarts of UNO who helped me through their mentoring, their schooling, their advice to become one of you. Слава Україні!
Репортажі про культурно-громадську діяльність відділу УНО в Канаді, спонсоровані фундацією Бориса Городинського.